how much do we how much is the unknown mentality kind of should be present or should be not present, and how do we freely express ourselves in Web3?
Okay, do you want to go? Do you want me to take it first?
Do you want to?
Damn it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge question. I think it's like a really, really big question. I was chatting with someone who I'll kind of keep anonymous, and one really funny trope that I think people leaned on and continue to lean on is this idea like Web3 doesn't care if you're about your race or your sex or your gender and blah, 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 blah. It cares about, what you put on chain. And I just don't think that's true. I think like at the end of the day, we're still human and we make a lot of decisions, affinities based off of, does this person share certain values? Does this person look like me? Do I find this person attractive? Like, for some reason, all of the musicians I like are also really attractive. I wonder why. And I think it poses a really interesting question in a very, let's just say, identity fluid space that is internet, right? It really gives off like Tumblr vibes. I spent a lot of time on Tumblr as a kid and I had like 7 Tumblrs, and each one was this idea of like fractionalized identity, right? I think what we saw with like 10K PFPs and the way people sort of chose to hold on to some, like go of others, reflect them on their Twitter obvies or Instagram obvies, was a sort of expression of the larger ecosystem as a sort of Tumblr identity, right? Where like, I'm a punk here, I'm a penguin here. It was very Comic-Con-esque, but I do think like even that kind of created affinities across the web, because if someone held a similar obvi, perhaps there was some deeper connection that could be explored there, right? So I think it's obvious that we do care about these things and we use them as sort of macro sorting filters because the world is really large and noisy. And I think that is okay because the need to express one's race or sexuality, what have you, seems to be quite core to what it means to be human, right? So I think to act like those things don't matter or that like we can kind of abstract those things away, I think that has its natural limits.
I definitely kind of like agree with Reggie's take because, it's like it was kind of like this big trope of like, oh yeah, nothing matters. Like the only thing that matters is your work. But even within that, like as someone, I think, who spends a lot of time at like looking at images and just kind of like being deeply on the internet, is like we still bring all of these aesthetic choices. And, even among kind of like the deep internet, I would say like, I think there's still like a large prevalence of like still like predominantly like white aesthetic, especially in like a lot of like found images and mood boards. And so it's kind of like within that, it's still trying to like figure out, okay, like we say it doesn't matter, but like the aesthetic choices of communities still translates into these digital spaces, regardless of whether you're identifying with any sort of gender identity or race. And I think that's like more so what I find interesting is like, okay, like we can still see this. And then like you kind of can like compare and contrast when like, again, these spaces and these communities devirtualize. And I think a lot of it, I think there is still like, you do have to have the affordance of like a lot of time and like the privilege and resources of time to be deeply online. And so I think that kind of is always like, something to think about. But yeah, I mean, it's like, I do think it is cool you can operate anonymously. Like there's definitely like artists who I know through the internet who I like have no clue of anything about them. But I do think it is kind of like a dangerous trope to be like, oh, no one cares. Like it doesn't matter. Because it definitely does matter. Like, we live in like a world of aesthetics.
About our current financial system is